So a major consulting firm aptly characterized changes in the demographics in this country as an age quake, and referred to the fact that as a result of the aging of the baby boom population, we're going to see successive waves of increasingly older populations experiencing explosive growth over the next 30 years. This decade, we saw the major growth of the population age 65 to 74. The next decade, to 2020 to 2030, we're going to see the explosive growth of the age 75 and 84 population, increasing well over 50%. And then 10 years later, as the baby boomer reaches its oldest stage in their lives, we're going to see this growth of the 85 and older population. And what this means very simply, that even if our current levels of poverty, even if our current levels of Alzheimer's or physical disability remain constant, because of these growth trajectories, we're going to see an explosive number of older people going forward in the future. And therefore, it becomes even more important than ever to understand the quality of life of older people in this country and some of the factors that might influence that quality of life going forward. Older people hear, in fact, a far more optimistic message than the demographic would suggest. They're told, well, if you take care of yourself, if you take responsibility for your body, you don't have to become sick or disabled. You don't have to experience declines in mental functioning. If you do all those exercises with your brain, if you take personal responsibility, if you're proactive, then in fact, old age may not even occur at all. You can become late middle age forever. Now, this message didn't happen by chance. Few messages do. It was certainly promulgated by the work of a large study and writing by two scientists, Dr. John Rowe and Robert Kahn, and they wrote a book in 1998 called Successful Aging, which essentially set out these principles. And we all know the drill. Get those preventive health checkups, take those meds, make sure you exercise your brain, get that sleep, and don't eat that cake. But the Rowe and Kahn message was even more impressive for its ambitious goals. It argued that growing old means not only healthy aging, but older people growing old should continually remain active. In their words, stay productive, keep contributing to society, keep active, and make sure your body and mind are active too. And once again, we know the drill. Whatever makes you happy and active, whether it's getting a part-time job, volunteering, or playing those endless games on the computer, and knitting is okay as well. Get that exercise in, make sure your body's working well, make sure you look great, and don't be afraid to look good. Well, something was missing, however, from that description of successful aging and how to grow old well. And what was missing was any kind of understanding of the fact that whether or not the quality of life you experience in old age is better or worse may depend considerably on where you live, on what kind of dwellings and what kind of buildings, what kind of neighborhoods, what communities. And the simple argument that I've made throughout most of my academic writing is that in some places more than others, it will be more feasible to avoid disease. It will be more feasible to maintain your higher mental and physical functioning. In some places more than others, it will be easier to be actively engaged in life and productive and to look good. And then for those of you who are more academic, you'll recognize this focus is a subfield of gerontology, which is known as environmental gerontology. And of course, there's some obvious implications. In some places, more than others, we're going to have good friends and neighbors. Some of us live in dwellings that have more fall risks than others, and filled with clutter and with stairs and the rest. Some of us are more or less fortunate, depending on your view of the world, to be living close to our adult children, who might, as we know, serve as the most important caregivers of older people in our society. What kind of leisure and what kind of recreation opportunities you want depends very much on where you live. Some places, certainly some states, offer better health and particularly long-term care than others, and some states are more likely to support you if you want to stay at home, whereas other states are more likely to push you into some kind of senior housing facility.
Or just leave you on the wait list.
And certainly, as Larry correctly points out, those wait lists vary tremendously depending on where you live in this country, for services that are really not deserving to be waiting for, but should in fact be available to you at a moment's notice. And very importantly, especially in this era of smart technology and the Internet of Things and information and communication technology, Internet services are not equal everywhere. And it's becoming very important to have Internet services, and obviously some places are more fortunate than others in terms of having those kinds of services. Sometimes, however, I do have doubts. I say to myself, maybe I'm making too big a thing of this environment. Maybe environment in place is not as important as it should be, but I move on and look carefully here. We all wish we had those kinds of genes, to be sure. So, an obvious question that arises is, all right, you've argued that place matters. Well, how do you decide? How do you evaluate whether or not older people are living in their right place? How do you evaluate whether, and this is why I titled my book, how do you evaluate whether older people are living in the right place in order to achieve that successful aging goals that those experts argued are so important for a good quality of life? And on the one hand, you have the views of the expert, the occupational therapist, the social worker, the registered nurse, the long-term care expert, the social worker, the academic, who has all kinds of evaluative tools and are quite willing and they believe able to determine whether or not you're living in a place that is appropriate for your lifestyle and your capabilities. Obviously, those objective evaluations assume that older people also see the world the same way as those experts and professionals. In contrast to these, what we call objective evaluations or scientific evaluations, so-called scientific evaluations, we have the views, an alternative way of thinking about whether or not older people are living in the right place. And that is to listen to older people themselves, to try to understand how older people feel about their residential, their housing, and the places in which they receive care. So, I have two purposes, two selfish purposes to presenting. This is, of course, my book. But beyond the book, I want you to focus in, if you will, on this little photo here. And let's zero in a little bit. Now, they look happy. The dog looks happy. They're smiling, they look very comfortable, they have a good view of the street, they're interacting. By all measures, this is a great place for these people to live. Well, that's not the case if you're part of many of the design professions concerned about what makes a good design environment for older people to age successfully. Because from the views of the experts, steps, uh-oh, that's a danger sign. For those of you who are interested in jargon, it violates what is often called visitability home design principles. And of course, there's rationale for this argument, is that stairs increase the stairs in the home, and especially particularly the entrance of a home, increases the likelihood of people falling. When we get those impairments and arthritis, God forbid, when we have to rely on more heavy-duty assistive devices like walkers or wheelchairs, stairs are public enemy number one. So from the point of view of the design expert, very different from the view of the older person, dwellings with stairs should be avoided at all costs. So here we have a classic example of this very simple contradiction between how older people might view their world and how experts view the world. I've often talked to older people as well as younger undergraduate students, and I keep emphasizing that observation we just made about the older people on the steps communicate to us that aging successfully is not just the realm of the professional, but it's the realm of individual views. Aging is a very personal thing. And of course, we're easily persuaded. We have all kinds of messages from the media and professionals and friends and family members, of course, have no shortage of advice about how we should conduct our lives. But I argue that when deciding on the right place to live for most older people, it's important as much as possible for them to know thyself. Know what makes them happy. Make those evaluations based on your past experiences, on your memories of what is good and what is bad. Know what moves and motivates you. And yes, of course, listen to the expert, listen to professional, but by all means, try to understand how you view the world that might be very differently from the views of the professional. And above all, before you make any abrupt decision about where you live or any transformations about where you're living, try it out first if you can. If you're trying to decide to move to a different location, go there first for a vacation. Go there first for a vacation. If you have to move into an independent living community or an assisted living community, by all means make multiple visits if you can, at lunchtime particularly, to see how it's going and see how the staff is interacting with the residents. Before making any major modifications in your home, really try to envision how that's going to affect your life going forward. The most difficult advice that we have to give older persons about how they should think about their own old age and how they should influence what kind of place they should live in or not, is to envision what I call future scenarios. And envisioning future scenarios when you get older is an extremely hard thing to do because we don't want to deal with future scenarios. And those future scenarios are well known to the expert, but when it comes to our own personal aging body, we really try to avoid thinking about them as much as possible. And that has to do with whether or not a spouse might pass away, whether or not you might get divorced, more happily, whether you might want to be remarried again. It includes the idea of what happens when my health begins to go downhill of either me or my spouse, because that changes the whole dynamics of my living arrangement. It has to do with whether or not I'll be able to afford the cost of living in this place going forward, whether or not I'll be able to maintain the house like I used to when I was younger. It includes the possibility that the neighborhood that I once lived in and included people who were very compatible with me, that neighborhood has changed and I'm not quite sure I like my neighbors as much. It includes the possibility that maybe one day somebody's going to grab my keys, probably one of my adult sons or daughters, and say, this is not the time for you to drive anymore, and what will happen then? By all means, we have to look at these future scenarios if we want to decide whether or not where we live right now is going to be appropriate going forward. And it's very hard to make plans ahead of these scenarios, but as much as possible, if we can think them through, then perhaps we'll be more prepared when we have to make those residential decisions that will try to compensate for those unfortunate future scenarios in the future. So, as an attempt to try to understand how older people feel about where they live, I developed this theory. It's called the theory of residential normalcy. It sounds rather academic, but actually it's a very simple idea. It essentially tries to explain, why do older people themselves, if you ask older people, why do older people themselves feel that they occupy appropriate places? And the theory very simply argues that older people achieve what I call residential normalcy when overall they have very positive emotional experiences about where they live or where they receive care. And the residential normalcy theory very importantly recognizes that this may not happen immediately. Residential normalcy may often only be achieved after we take actions. We try to change things. We try to change the interior design of our dwelling. We try to improve the accessibility of getting to places. So residential normalcy may often only occur after we try to take actions and cope with something which, at least initially, seems out of sorts. The idea of focusing on emotional experiences is actually very purposive, because psychologists and biologists tell us that virtually all people are wired to experience emotional experiences. And the beauty of emotional experiences, it's a language that is, can be measured in all cultures, in all countries, whatever language one speaks. The language of emotional experiences is a constant, it's consistent. And just as importantly, we can look at emotional reactions to your ordinary home, but also your emotional reactions to living in an assisted living community or even a nursing home. So it's a very useful approach to measuring whether or not older people feel that they are living in congruent places. So we identified two different categories of emotional experiences, and they're quite different and arguably independent of each other. On the one hand, we characterize experiences that are residential comfort. Very simply, do we get pleasure from where we live? Do we get enjoyment from where we live? Do we feel uplifted when we come to our house or apartment or neighborhood or community? Do we feel stimulated? Is it a place where we have minimal hassles? And very importantly for older persons, is it often a place where we identify past memories? The homes of older people are often autobiographical archaeologies of their past lives, and many of them conjuring up very good, warm, and wonderful experiences of the past. So those are residential comfort experiences. Residential mastery experiences are a very different ilk. They address whether or not, after living in a place, older people feel competent, whether they feel capable, whether you feel empowered where you live. You feel that where you live you don't have to behave in personally objectionable ways, that you don't have to cater to other people's whim, but you can do what you want to do. You can engage in the activities that you want to engage in. You feel proud of where you live because your house communicates a successful past life. Residential mastery experiences have everything to do with not having to give up control or to surrender your empowerment to somebody else. Rather, you are in control. So we speak of people being in their residential comfort zone very simply when they look at all their residential comfort experiences, those sources of pleasure and enjoyment and good memories. People are in their residential comfort zone when the totality of these experiences are overall positive. And we speak of people being in residential comfort zones. In contrast, we speak of people being in their residential mastery zones when in consideration of all their experiences and all their interactions with their environment, with the people and everything in which they're relating to in their everyday lives, whether those experiences overall contribute to their feeling in control and competent. And when all those experiences overall are positive, we speak of older people being in their residential mastery zones. The ideal world, maybe a utopian world, maybe we can achieve perfection in where we live and where we receive care. But at the very least, we should be shooting for that sweet spot to live where on the one hand, we're both in our comfort zone and we're also in our mastery zone. We're both getting pleasure from where we live, but also we're feeling competent, empowered, and in control of where we live. And when we experience both those sets of experiences, we speak of older people achieving residential normalcy. For most older people, not only in the United States, but also globally, and there's a very large literature in this, for most older people all over the world, their idea of residential normalcy is to age in place, to stay put in their dwellings as long as possible, to remain in those dwellings that they occupied in late middle age, and to hold tight, and to remain in their conventional dwellings and apartments and neighborhoods and communities as long as possible. And that is despite life-changing events. And we have all kinds of studies that try to estimate what happens after widowhood, what happens after decline of income, what happens after major health and disability change. And yes, for sure, those major events contribute to some people making changes in their environments and moving elsewhere. But for the most part, the majority of older people, even after they experience these life-changing events, they stay put. Very different. I see many people in this audience will appreciate this. How many of you have tried to put on a piece of clothing, a suit or a dress that you bought 10, 12 years ago? Does it fit? And what do you do with it? You give it away, you discard it, you share it, or maybe if you're a hoarder, you put it in some box. Very different than how we treat an older home or an older renter apartment. We tend to hold tight. Despite the fact that things may appear to be out of sorts, we stay put as long as possible in our current homes and apartments. But the fact remains that even as older people are staying put or remaining as long as possible, that doesn't prevent them from experiencing major problems. And throughout the years, we have cataloged at least 6 major categories of problems that older people confront in their efforts to stay put. They may find that the housing has become unaffordable, perhaps because the expenses of maintaining the house has just become too taxing. Or they live in that condominium apartment where all of a sudden those one-time assessment charges are just taking too much of a toll. Older people find themselves in dwellings that are frankly difficult for them to navigate. Because they have difficulty climbing stairs, they may only use the first story of their house. They may have difficulty of reaching those high shelves. Because they haven't made any attempt to make any kind of modifications to their bathrooms or the kitchen, they're at greater risk of falling. They find themselves suddenly in a situation where those activities which they used to be so comfortable doing, so easily doing, whether from getting to a neighbor, to a doctor, or getting to a friend's house, you're simply navigating around their house, suddenly those activities become much more difficult and taxing and stressful. And of course, we're increasingly documenting what is clearly becoming a major epidemic, a social epidemic among older people. We have far too big a share of older people in this country who simply feel lonely. They simply don't feel that they have those people who act as their confidants, as their emotional supports, someone to talk to, someone to take them to the doctor when they require them. They really feel socially isolated. And of course, neighborhoods often do not remain the same. Some neighborhoods go downhill. Many of those apartment condominium, high-rise condo apartments in South Florida, for example, which used to be filled with people that were consistent with the ethnic and religious background of the older person, they change, and somehow the neighbors of older person no longer are sympathetic or look at them in any kind of kindly way. Surroundings change, even as our views of how, even as our views may not want to change with them. And lastly, what is often viewed as one of the serious constraints faced by older persons is the fact that we have a population of older people today who are predominantly in suburban America, another significant share in rural America, and that's all great if you have easy access to a car to get yourself around, but when driving becomes more difficult, when more dangerous, when you feel less secure driving, and when you lose that full ability to drive a car, suddenly you become you're suddenly feeling very incompetent, very out of control, because all those things that you took for granted that you could easily obtain and on a daily basis disappear. So in the worst case scenario, we find that there's a significant share of older persons who are both out of their comfort zone and out of their mastery zone. Not only are they no longer getting pleasure from their neighbors or their friends, but increasingly they're out of their mastery zone because they're having so much difficulty doing things. They're feeling increasingly incompetent. They feel that their world is spinning out of control because they can't do those things that they so were accustomed to doing in their past lives. As it turns out, very often it's neither all good or all bad. In fact, we often find that older people are living in what we might call an emotional battlefield, because the place in which they live is both a source of good things, good experiences, but also bad experiences. And we can illustrate that by two very simple classic exemplars of older people who, on the one hand, are in their comfort zone and out of their mastery zone, or alternatively, out of their comfort zone and in their mastery zone. And in the first example, we have lots of situations where older people say, oh, I love this house. I love the friends in my neighborhood. I have great memories and I feel so emotionally attached to where I live. And there's lots of leisure and recreation opportunities for me here. This is a great place to live. But at the same time, because they've experienced decline in their abilities to do things, because of declining health and physical abilities, they suddenly find themselves also at the same time saying, I'm having difficulty getting to places that I used to get to. And I'm a little worried about falling. My house is on different layers, and increasingly I'm just feeling very insecure because I'm not sure I can count on people to help me, especially those living alone and those whose family members, their adult children, are living far away. I just don't feel confident. I don't feel capable that if something happens to me, I'm going to be taken care of. So here's this classic situation. They like to get pleasure, but at the same time, they're out of their mastery zone. They're feeling increasingly out of control, feeling less capable of doing things. Alternatively, let's zero our attention to older people who are living in our assisted living developments throughout the country, and certainly in Florida is well represented. Nobody likes the idea of having to move into an assisted living development, but sometimes it is a good alternative for those who want once again to feel secure and say, I don't have to worry about getting my food and getting my meals. I don't have to worry. I feel someone's looking out for me. I feel fairly competent and less worrisome living in this assisted living. But gosh, this ain't my home. My quarters, look how small they are. And frankly, the other people here, often this balancing act of this balancing the contradictions. Which is more important, the feel comfortable, to be pleasurable experiences, or to feel competent and feel in control. And often it's a very continual online battle because the older person is pulled in different directions as a result of these two very different sets of emotional experiences. Well, the good news is the fact that, and this is where most studies in the past stopped. They said, well, this is how it is. But in fact, that's not how life is. We know that older people have this ability to deal with something that is wrong, deal with something that is no longer consistent with their needs and their goals and their lifestyles and the capabilities. Most older people, when confronted with problems, don't just sit passively back and do nothing. Rather, they take proactive steps. And this is very, of course, consistent with that original dictum of the Rowan Kahn of successful aging of saying, you know, something goes wrong, that doesn't mean you have to accept it. Rather, you should try to do something. We should try to be proactive. We should try to change our residential and care settings in such a way as to once again achieve residential normalcy. Older people cope in two ways, interestingly. And the experts, of course, are not frowned upon one of these categories. On the one hand, some older people do, in some ways, unfortunately, cope with their inappropriate places to live by saying, well, maybe it's not too bad. You know, look, I'm better off than my friends. You know, it could be worse. In effect, they're engaged in a form of denial, of de-emphasis, of saying, well, I don't have to do anything because it's really not as bad as it looks. So I look away. These are called by developmental psychologists accommodative or mind strategies. You cope with your mind. In contrast, assimilative strategies, you're coping by doing something. You take action. You make changes in the design of your dwelling. You try to find a way that perhaps you can find an economic way to afford Uber as a way to take you around when you want to. Most strenuously you say, well, maybe this is time for me to move from this house because it's just not working anymore, and perhaps if I move somewhere else I can find once again that residential normalcy that I once had in my previous house, my present house. Some of us cope better, and we know who cope better. All of us know people who have experienced incredible stressful and miserable events in their life, and they snap back and they bounce back and they recover, and amazingly they achieve once again that what we might call residential normalcy. These are resilient persons. These are persons who have stronger confidence in their own abilities to make things happen. They're confident in their abilities to overcome whatever problems they confront. They take actions. And very importantly, these persons also have what we call adaptive flexibility. And that's a fancy word for simply saying, hey, I'm open to new ideas. I'm open to new approaches. You've got a new technology that might make it easier for me to monitor if I fall or not. Maybe I'll take advantage. You've got a technology that will alert my adult child in a different state that I haven't left my bedroom and therefore there's something wrong. I'm open to this possibility. People who also cope best with their problems, interestingly, those who are as much as possible making their own decisions. Of course, you may have to share decision making if you're vulnerable with a trusting adult son or daughter, but as much as possible, those who cope most effectively are making their own decisions. The solutions are not imposed by others. They're part of your own attempt to cope effectively with the problem that you have at hand. And very importantly, people who cope best are living in places that offer them opportunities, that offer them services and care and activities and goods and health offerings that make it easier for them to cope with the downsides that they're experiencing. We have a good example, or one of the major movements taking place throughout the world is something that we call as age-friendly places. And age-friendly places is simply an effort to try to make the communities in which you live more supportive and more conducive to older persons experiencing declines and difficulties and who need some assistance. It was initially a product of the World Health Organization, something they call the active aging framework. More recently, AARP has, in the United States, initiated a major effort to also make communities age-friendly. And when we talk about age-friendly, it's a very simple idea, and let me just quote from one of the reports. It's the idea of optimizing opportunities for good health and participating in society and security for the obvious goal of enhancing the quality of life in old age. And it has to do with improving transportation and housing, making housing more affordable, making long-term care both more affordable, more accessible, and more responsive to individual needs. It has to do with improving the access that older people have with their communities, whether through transportation or through new technologies as a way to link them up to people, to alert them and have responses to their problems. So age-friendly themes are hopefully something that will develop even further in our country, and to the extent that it represents one major part of coping successfully. It's not only important for individuals to be resilient and to have their own decision-making control, there has to be opportunities out there in the community for them to take advantage of, for them to be able to take advantage of, and not be restricted because of cultural barriers, because of affordability barriers, because of gender barriers. And to the extent then that we can make opportunities in our community more responsive, then in turn we make it more likely that older people can cope with their discrepant housing and rental places in which they live, make it more possible for them to achieve, hopefully, residential normalcy. That's how it looks in the terrible schematic. If anyone is very interested in that, I'm happy to share it with them. But it has very pragmatic implications. The residential normalcy is now being applied in countries throughout the world. It's being applied in the United States by people as arcane as realtors who are trying to appeal to older persons to find more appropriate places for them to live. And hopefully it's an ideal that we can achieve for most older people, for them at the same time to be both in their residential comfort zone and also to be in their residential mastery zone. Thank you very, very much.